Anna's heart raced as she stood in the dim hallway, her trembling hand reaching out for the closed door. Inside, muffled sobs escaped between Emily's sharp words. "You ruined everything." The sound of the door slamming had felt like a physical blow. Now, as she stared at the peeling paint of the frame, tears blurred her vision. Her fingers curled into a fist against her chest. "What have I done?" she whispered, the ache in her voice filling the empty silence. Her mind raced back to a time when Emily's laughter would echo through their tiny apartment. Anna had saved every piece of artwork her daughter brought home from school, framing them on the walls like treasured masterpieces. Those were the days when Emily would cling to her, asking for one more bedtime story, a different lifetime. Now the warmth of those memories burned her chest as her daughter's words replayed over and over. Anna sank into the worn couch in the living room, her hands shaking as they gripped the edges of a letter she had received earlier that day. Its contents felt heavier than any burden she had carried before. She unfolded it slowly, staring at the bold black letters that made her past feel as close as her own shadow. No matter how much she wanted to forget, the past had a way of catching up. Across the room, a photograph rested on the side table. Emily's beaming face looked back at her, framed by golden sunlight and carefree laughter. Anna's fingers brushed the edges of the frame. "I did everything to protect you," she murmured, as though speaking to the Emily in the photograph. The sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts. Anna's head snapped up, but she didn't move as she heard Emily's voice, sharp, angry, and filled with betrayal. "I don't think I can ever forgive her," she said into her phone. Anna's chest tightened as if the words were aimed directly at her. She wanted to storm into Emily's room, fall to her knees, and beg her daughter to understand. But how could she explain the choices she had made? How could she tell her that the person she used to be was gone, buried under years of trying to build a better life? The weight of regret pulled her deeper into the couch. She crumpled the letter in her hands, the edges cutting into her palms. It felt like a punishment she deserved. But what hurt more was the realization that her silence had cost her daughter's trust, and now the gap between them felt too wide to bridge. Anna's gaze returned to the closed door at the end of the hallway. Somewhere behind it, Emily was crying. Somewhere behind it, Anna's past had become her daughter's present. The bond they once shared now seemed irreparably shattered. Anna's feet pounded against the cracked pavement of a dimly lit alley. The cold night air burned her lungs, but she didn't dare stop. In her arms, a duffel bag weighed her down, its contents rattling with every step. Behind her, the piercing wail of police sirens grew louder, chasing her like the shadows of her own choices. Her heart raced, and the voice of Mark, cruel and commanding, echoed in her mind. "You have no choice." She stumbled on a loose brick, but caught herself against a wall, the rough surface scraping her palms. Her breaths came in ragged gasps as she glanced over her shoulder. The red and blue lights reflected on the wet pavement, growing closer with every second. She clutched the duffel bag tighter, her knuckles white. This wasn't the life she had wanted. This wasn't supposed to be her story. Years before, Mark had charmed her with promises of a better future. He painted a picture of security, of escape from her lonely existence, but those promises had come with chains. At first it was small favours, delivering packages, smiling sweetly at his friends. She hadn't asked questions, trusting his reassurances that it was harmless. By the time she realised the truth, she was in too deep. Mark didn't just hold her heart, he held her freedom. "Anna, this is the last time," she had told herself countless nights as she lay awake, staring at the ceiling of their run-down apartment. But the last time never came. Mark's grip tightened, his threats more explicit, his love more toxic. She reached a dead end in the alley. Panic surged through her as she searched for an escape. A fire escape ladder hung above her, just out of reach. Dropping the bag, she jumped, her fingers barely grazing the metal. Tears stung her eyes as she realized how trapped she truly was. The sirens were deafening now, and she could hear footsteps. She sank to the ground, clutching the duffel bag to her chest, and whispered a silent prayer for strength. The memory dissolved as Anna blinked, finding herself back in her dimly lit living room. The faint sound of the television filled the silence, but her mind was far from present. In her hands, she held Emily's photo, her teenage daughter's radiant smile beaming back at her. "I did it for you," she murmured, her voice breaking. The weight of her past pressed against her chest, suffocating her with guilt. Anna had testified against Mark, sending him to prison. It had been the hardest decision of her life, one that left her with scars she would carry forever. The courtroom's cold, sterile walls were etched in her memory. She had spoken every painful truth, her voice shaking but resolute. In that moment, she wasn't just fighting for her freedom, she was fighting for Emily's future, a future untouched by the darkness she had endured. But now, as she sat in her living room clutching the photo, Anna wondered if her silence about the past had only built new barriers. Emily didn't know the truth, not all of it. And if she ever found out, would she see her mother as a survivor or a liar? Emily stormed into the living room, her face flushed with anger, clutching a crumpled letter in her hand. She slammed it down on the coffee table with a force that made Anna flinch. "Is it true?" Emily's voice cracked, a mix of fury and betrayal. Anna's throat tightened as she reached for the letter, her hands trembling, but Emily snatched it away. "Don't you dare lie to me again," she hissed, her eyes burning with tears. Anna's world felt like it was crumbling. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The letter, now torn at the edges, was the tangible proof of a past she had buried deep, a past she had hoped would never resurface. "Emily, let me explain." "Explain?" Emily's voice rose, echoing through the room. "I found everything, Mom. The article, the trial, Mark, all of it." Her words hung heavy in the air, each one a dagger slicing through Anna's heart. "How could you lie to me my entire life? How could you pretend to be someone you're not?" Tears welled in Anna's eyes, but she forced herself to meet Emily's gaze. "I did it to protect you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You were so young. You didn't need to know about any of it." "I didn't need to know." Emily's voice was laced with disbelief. She threw her hands up in frustration, pacing the room. "Mum, I'm not a child anymore. Did you think I'd never find out? Did you think you could keep this a secret forever?" Anna's hands shook as she tried to bridge the chasm forming between them. "I was scared, Emily. I've made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but everything I did, every choice I made, was to give you a life away from that darkness. I wanted to protect you from it." Emily stopped pacing and turned to face her mother, her expression softening for a brief moment before hardening again. "But you didn't protect me. You lied to me. Do you know how humiliating it was to find out this way? Reading about my own mother's trial online? Learning from strangers instead of from you?" Anna's knees felt weak, and she sank into the nearest chair, burying her face in her hands. "I didn't know how to tell you," she admitted, her voice muffled by her sobs. "I was so ashamed. I thought if I could just move on, if I could be a better mother, it would erase everything." Emily's shoulders slumped, her anger giving way to exhaustion. She sat down across from Anna, the letter still clutched in her hand. "You should have trusted me," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I'm not a child anymore, Mum. I deserve to know the truth." The room fell silent, the air heavy with unspoken pain. Anna looked up, her tear-streaked face filled with regret. "You're right," she said finally. "You deserved to know. I should have told you sooner." Emily's grip on the letter loosened, and it fell to the table between them. For the first time that evening, her gaze softened, but the distance between them still felt vast, an uncharted territory of hurt and betrayal they weren't sure how to cross. The living room was bathed in the soft glow of moonlight filtering through the curtains. Emily stood in the centre, clutching a small tarnished locket that dangled from her fingers. It was the same locket her mother had given her on her 5th birthday, a gift she had cherished until the cracks in their bond had dulled its significance. Her voice, barely above a whisper, broke the stillness. "Why didn't you tell me?" Anna's footsteps were hesitant as she approached from the shadows of the hallway. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears as she saw the locket in Emily's hand, a relic of the love they once shared. "Emily, she faltered, her words caught in the tangled web of guilt and regret that had consumed her for years. Emily turned to face her, the pain in her eyes unmistakable. "All this time I thought I knew you, but you were hiding this entire other life from me. Do you know how that feels?" Her voice cracked, trembling with a mix of anger and sorrow. Anna stepped closer, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, as if she were pleading for forgiveness. "I never wanted you to bear the weight of my mistakes," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "I was trying to protect you from the darkness I lived through. I thought I was sparing you, but I see now that I only built walls between us." Emily's gaze dropped to the locket. She turned it over in her hand, her fingers brushing against the engraving on the back. "Forever, your mum." The words felt both comforting and cruel in that moment. "You thought you were protecting me, but you didn't trust me enough to let me in," she said, her voice quieter now, but still charged with emotion. "I needed you to be honest with me, Mom. I needed to know who you really are." Anna's tears spilled over as she sank into the couch, her hands trembling in her lap. "I was ashamed, Emily, ashamed of the person I used to be. I've spent every day trying to be better, trying to be the mother you deserve. But I see now that hiding the truth only hurt you more." She looked up at her daughter, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. For everything." The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Slowly, Emily walked over to the couch and sat down beside her mother. She held the locket tightly for a moment before slipping it back around her neck. The small click of the clasp was deafening in the quiet room. Anna watched, her breath catching in her throat. "Emily." "I'm not ready to forgive you," Emily said, her voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. "But maybe, one day, I will be. And maybe we can start again." Anna reached out tentatively, her hand resting gently over Emily's. For the first time in years, a fragile thread of hope began to weave its way through the space between them. "I'll spend the rest of my life proving that I deserve that chance," Anna whispered. And as they sat together in the quiet glow of the moonlight, their hands clasped, the first steps toward healing were taken.